Welcome to Neurodivergent Faith, a podcast to help you navigate the beautiful and complicated intersection of neurodivergence and Christian faith and practice. Whether you're neurodivergent yourself, or you're a friend, family member, or church leader seeking to understand more about the neurodivergent Christian experience, you're in the right place. My name's Josh Davis. I'm autistic, ADHD, a spiritual director, and an ordained pastor, and I'm delighted to have you join me as we explore the unique ways neurodivergent people experience God, worship, community, and scripture, along with special interests, sensory and attention differences, social and communication challenges, and much more. Together, we'll break down barriers, confront misconceptions and assumptions, and celebrate the beautiful diversity of God's creation in all of us. So, if you're ready to think deeply and creatively, to reconcile your faith and your brain wiring, or you just want to hear what it sounds like when neurodivergence and Christianity have a conversation, come on in. It's a bit messy, definitely interesting, and we wouldn't have it any other way. We don't do small talk here, so let's jump into something real, raw, and robust. Are you ready? Take a deep breath. Hold it. And let it out with a sigh. All right, here we go. Hi everyone, Josh Davis here. And first and foremost, I just want to quickly say, if you are like me, then you might be getting annoyed with the podcast intro because you've already heard it twice. If you're listening to this as episode 3 and you've already listened to episodes 1 and 2, you might be getting annoyed with that intro. You already know what it says, and your mind is predicting it in advance, and it's just driving you crazy. I made the intro so you can just click that 30-second advance button 3 times as soon as the intro music starts, and it should take you right to the content of the podcast. Now, some neurodivergent people find repetition really comforting, or certain kinds of repetition comforting. I actually do find some kinds of repetition comforting. But when it comes to, I can't listen to the same podcast more than once. I can't watch the same movie more than once. My brain loses all interest in it once I know what's going to happen. I have a really hard time if I'm listening to somebody talk and I know how they're going to finish this sentence, or I've heard this story before. It's super hard for me to stay engaged. So some of you might be like that, and if that's the case, then just hit that advance. If you find repetition comforting, great. I'm going to leave that intro on at least for season 1, and you can listen to it every time. And hopefully that brings you some comfort. Okay. In today's episode, I want to share with you a little bit more about who I am and a little bit more about my story. I've been surprised that before I told my friends and family about this podcast, complete strangers were listening. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Josh Davis. I'm autistic, ADHD, late discovered, late diagnosed in my late 40s. I am a creative pastor, ordained minister. I'm a spiritual director. I'm a husband and father. I have led a nonprofit organization for the last 20-something years. I am a missionary kid. I grew up some in the United States and some in the Dominican Republic. I've got 2 different languages on the inside of me and different cultures on the inside of me. I'm a musician. I've been playing music since I was 4 years old and got my first violin. And music is one of my most happy places. I can lose all track of time if I am songwriting. It's one of my favorite things to do. I feel like my body, my mind, and my heart are all engaged in the process of creating a new song. And I can lose all track of time when I am recording background vocals for songs. I love to sing, and I love to sing in harmony. I especially love to sing in harmony with myself. There's an attunement there, and it's just so easy. There's a blend there that's just so easy, and I'll lay down one background vocal and then immediately be like, ooh, I hear another one. And I'll lay down another one, and the next thing I know, I've got like 16 tracks of background vocals on a song. So I get super fascinated by that. I could do that for hours and not recognize that I've got to go to the bathroom or that I'm hungry. The world is... I am oblivious to the world in those moments, and I'm in flow, and I absolutely love it. As you may have guessed, music is one of my special interests, has been my most enduring special interest since I was a kid. And one of the other most enduring special interests for me is people. Psychology, sociology, culture, language. I'm just fascinated. People's stories. I just love to learn about people, and I always have. So I want to share with you a little bit today of what I'm calling my discovery/diagnosis journey. And the reason I frame it like that is because my diagnosis is important, and I'll share more about that, but actually it was the discovery of myself as autistic, which came before my diagnosis, that was actually the most profound for me. And for many people, in this day and age, you might not have access to diagnosis, to the kind of care or process or professionals to actually make that diagnosis. But I am actually a firm believer that self-discovery of autism ADHD is legitimate, and I affirm the goodness of that. That was my story, and I want to share a little bit more about that with you. But first, I do want to say I see some real benefits to people sharing their neurodivergent discovery diagnosis stories. Why are stories like this important? I feel like neurodivergent stories are beneficial for a few important reasons. I'm just going to list a few of them. Number one, I would say increased understanding and awareness. So hearing personal stories about neurodivergent experiences, I think, can break down stereotypes and misconceptions. It helps others both within and outside of the neurodivergent community to understand the diversity of human brains and how different neurological wiring affects behavior, learning, social interaction, and just lived experience. In fact, it was a late diagnosed autistic woman sharing her story that was the gate that opened me to the possibility of my own neurodivergence. And I'm incredibly grateful for her generosity with her story. So that's part of why I want to share today. Number two, I think sharing stories can also normalize neurodivergence and the neurodivergent experience. Many people grow up feeling isolated or different because they don't conform to typical societal expectations. And when they hear about other people's experiences, it can be a relief to know, wow, I'm not alone. It can lead to better self-acceptance and reduce stigma. And that's also what happened for me. As I heard this late diagnosed autistic woman sharing her story, it was the first time in my life that I had ever felt seen. Like, oh my gosh, someone else gets a good portion of what it's like to be me in the world. And I was shocked. I had never heard anybody talk about these things before. And it was like she was describing, like narrating my own internal experience. And it was profoundly healing and validating for me. That's point number three. So not only do we increase understanding and awareness when we share stories, but also we normalize. And then third, it validates experiences. For individuals who are newly diagnosed, I feel like hearing other people's stories can validate their own experience. And it can help them understand that the challenges that they've faced are not their fault. Phew, that's huge. But are tied to their neurological makeup. And that can empower them to seek accommodations, therapy, support, perhaps a diagnosis or other resources that could improve their quality of life. So, neurodivergent diagnosis stories provide a vital platform for sharing experiences, advocating for change, and building community. And I believe they serve not only as a tool for personal validation and growth, but they also contribute to broader societal shifts toward understanding and inclusion. And so on this podcast, you're going to hear neurodivergent stories. In fact, I'm really excited. I'm getting ready this week to interview my first guest on the podcast, and look for that story coming later. But I'm super excited about, in this space, getting to engage with people's stories. And I thought I should probably start with my own. I will be happy to go first and be generous in that way. I've never shared my story like this. I've shared bits and pieces. So I'm curious to know how it's actually going to go for me as I try to put this into words and offer this to you. So let's just take a deep breath and take a moment to pause, and then I'll share my story. My discovery story and my diagnosis story actually starts with spiritual direction. And a number of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago now, I started receiving spiritual direction and found for the first time in my life a space where it was clear that for 1 hour each month, I was supposed to show up and pay attention to my own life. And I wasn't there to care for the other person. I was there to actually process and speak and engage with God and engage with my spiritual director and engage with myself. And that in itself was a really powerful experience, because most of my life I had spent engaging with other people on their terms. I had found a way that really worked for me, which was we don't have to go back and forth. I'll just keep asking you questions, and I'll make all the conversations about you. And when I did that, I found that it actually really worked. People really like it when you make conversations about them. And it worked for me because I have a hard time knowing how to do this back and forth in communication. So I could just stay in this one mode, clear role that I had inside my head. I'm going to draw this person out. I'm going to affirm them. I'm going to pay attention to them. I'm going to be curious about them. I'm going to make this conversation about them. But as I did that for years and years and years in my life, I realized, wait a second, there's not much room, if any room, for me in these conversations and in these relationships. And so spiritual direction and receiving that once a month was profoundly shifting for me. And it was in that container of spiritual direction, and as I was processing my relationship with God, maybe a year or two into the process, I sensed God's desire to have a face-to-face relationship with me. And I sensed God's invitation for me to discover my own face and bring myself to God just as I am. So when I sensed God inviting me to this face-to-face relationship, really my first thought was like, well, what does my face even look like? I'd been trying in my relationship with God my whole life to show up looking like Jesus. And I had lost any kind of connection with what my own face might look like. And it was this profound shift to realize, wait, God desires a face-to-face relationship with me. God desires me to show up as myself to my relationship with God. And as I began to pay attention to how my own internal experience, for the first time in my life, I was paying attention to my own internal experience of the world, of situations, of social interactions, etc., and to how my body and my mind respond to different situations, I realized a few things. One, I realized I have what's called aphantasia. I can't picture things in my head. People would talk about that all the time, and I thought they were just kind of speaking metaphorically until I realized, wait, no, people can actually picture things inside their head. You could say to me, picture a red apple inside your head, and I can tell myself words about that, but I can't actually see any kind of apple inside my head. That was interesting. I realized I also have significant memory challenges. I have trouble remembering anything from my childhood in an episodic kind of personal way. I don't remember my own stories of childhood as if they were mine. I can't go back and relive them. I can't feel what I felt back then. I have them in like a mental drawer in my mind that I can pull out. These are stories of Josh's childhood, and I can say them, and I have them memorized, but I don't actually experience memory in the same way that a lot of people do. I also realize I have alexithymia. Alexithymia is difficulty understanding and naming and connecting with feelings. And for me, it's a delayed processing kind of thing. And I have to get to my feelings through a more cognitive process. So it wasn't until I started praying the examen prayer on a regular basis. Every morning I would pray an examen prayer, looking back with God on the previous day. In that context, when I was safe and when I was quiet and I was in my low sensory environment in the morning by myself, then I could go back and access some of the feelings that I had from the previous day by kind of deducing what I was feeling. I didn't feel them in the moment, but I had sort of this delayed processing. I also realized I have mild, I don't know how to say this word, that's not it, prosopagnosia, maybe? I have mild prosopagnosia, maybe. That's face blindness. For years, my wife and I would joke around because I would watch a movie, and if the main character would wear a different color shirt or, I don't know, change their hairstyle in any small way, I would be like, is that so-and-so? Is that the main character? I would have trouble recognizing them. And then I would also often have the fear that I wouldn't be able to recognize the faces of people that I know really well. Facebook has been a huge game changer for me because before I show up to face-to-face meetings with people I haven't seen in a while, I can go on their Facebook page and I can kind of remember what their face looks like. I'm always afraid I won't be able to pick people out of a crowd. So I started noticing these things as I was trying to show up to God with my own face, and the way I was doing that was actually starting to pay attention to the way that I experienced the world. I started noticing that I had a lot of anxiety. I never realized this before, but I had a lot of anxiety in social situations. When there's more than one other person, my anxiety level would go up because I'm not only engaging with the person in front of me, but if there's more than one person in the room, I'm monitoring the connections between each person and each other person. It's almost like there's a line I can see. I don't see it in my mind because I don't do that, but it's almost like maybe more like, what do you call that? A seismograph that feels the vibrations of earthquakes. I can like sense the connection or disconnection between each person in the room and every other person in the room. And when a word is said or a phrase is said, I can feel how that ripples through the room and how that brings disconnection to some people or sets some people on edge, and other people might be energized by it, and then how that affects not just the whole vibe of the room, but also how it affects each person's relationship with each other person, and it's just overwhelming. It is just overwhelming. There's so much information to process in those situations, and my ears are super sensitive, and so I'm picking up oh my gosh, like if it's a room where everybody's having individual conversations, that is a nightmare because my brain just doesn't filter out the background noise or the things that are not part of the conversation I'm in. I'm hearing it all at the same level and intensity. And even if there's not a room where there's all these different conversations going on, if there's a room where there's people, even if the people are being relatively quiet, there's just so much noise in the room. I can actually hear the electricity in the walls. When a power outage happens and the electricity goes out, my whole body relaxes. Or when I unplug certain devices from the wall, even if they're not turned on, if I can unplug them from the wall, oh my gosh, so much less noise. I just realized how all of that was setting me on edge. And as I began to research some of these things, so I would notice it and then I would research it. And I had no idea what these terms were or anything. And I would find these terms, and every time I would find these different terms, in the list of possible explanations was autism. But I would always discount that. Like, I know I'm not autistic. I had this old view of what autism is, as many of us do. And I knew I was a social person. I knew I could make eye contact. I knew that I could interact with people in a way that made other people comfortable. And so I just assumed, because of all of those things, I didn't have autism. I was not autistic. Until, like I mentioned earlier, I was one day listening to a podcast, and I heard the story of a writer who had been diagnosed with autism in her mid-30s. And as she talked about her experience of the world, I felt so seen and understood. I had never had anyone describe my internal experience before, and when I had tried to describe it to other people, I never got any kind of resonance at all. It didn't make sense to other people. They would dismiss it. Sometimes I would be told that's not what I was actually experiencing. Anyway, I hear this podcast, and I feel seen and understood. And as some of you might be able to predict, I then went on a deep dive studying autism for 2+ hours every day for months. It was like I couldn't get enough of it. I was reading, I was watching videos, I was listening to podcasts. I was especially tuned into and really appreciating stories of autistic adults. When they would talk about what their experience was like, it was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I get this and other people could get me for the first time in my life. It was a profound experience. I remember how that shifted some things in my own understanding of the world and in my relationships. As I was coming to understand myself as autistic, I one day shared that with my wife, and she was really open, and she was like very curious and saw what I was talking about, and actually then began to see some of the things that had been conflict points for us for our whole marriage. She began to see those in a different light. I'll give you a small example. I can remember so many times when I would come home from a trip. I used to travel quite a bit for work and for ministry. And I would come home from a trip and the house would be rearranged, right? Furniture would be in new places, or we'd have a new mailbox, or the dishes in the kitchen were moved from one drawer to another drawer. And one of the beautiful things about who my wife is, she's an optimizer. So she's always looking for the best possible scenario. And she loves to be creative. And the house is kind of a canvas for her a lot of times and for her creativity. But I would come home and I would feel so bothered and upset because things were not where they were supposed to be. And I felt shame about that. I actually kept a lid on a lot of that. I shared maybe a level 2 out of 10 with her. When I would experience some of those things, I'd be feeling them like a 10 on the inside, but I would share it like a 2 with her. But that would be really frustrating to her, and she didn't understand where it was coming from, and she thought I was just being annoying or a killjoy or whatever. But like still to this day, I can go into the kitchen and I will open a certain drawer where the glasses for drinking used to be maybe 6 years ago, and they've probably been in 2 or 3 different places since then. But I'll still go to that same drawer because my mind is sure that that's where they belong. So just beginning to understand some of those things, all of a sudden, instead of being frustrated with me about some of those things, my wife had all this understanding. And it actually set her on a journey, which is hers to share, but understanding herself and her own neurodivergence. I also remember in this process, naming an experience that for me, I had my whole life where I just felt like I was outside of the human experience. Like there was humanity in this giant circle, and I was just outside, on the outside looking in. I wrestled with that my whole life in different ways. Sometimes I would try really hard to fit in. Sometimes I would say, forget it, I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to be my own person. But there was this sense of not belonging to the human race that I grew up with and that I experienced until recently. But in this process of discovery of my own neurodivergence, I first started with autism and then realized, wait, this is not just autism. This is also ADHD inside me. I've got both inside me. And I'll come back to that later because of how I used to understand that. I want to explain that to you because it might be pertinent. But yeah, I used to feel so outside of the human race. And as I was wrestling with this and discovering more of my own neurodivergence and sitting with God about it, I can remember very clearly one day God spoke almost like stamped a sentence on my heart and let me know that I expand the boundaries and the definition of what it is to be human just by being myself. I'm going to say that one more time because it was profound for me. I expand the boundaries and definition of what it means to be human just by being myself. And it was this like total reframe for me that I do belong. I am part of the human race. I may be different from the majority of people, but I actually expand the boundaries and definition of what it means to be human. And I would posit, I would suggest that actually every person alive does that. That sentence I just said applies to every person alive, neurotypical, neurodivergent, it doesn't matter. You expand the boundaries and definition of what it is to be human just by being yourself. I wonder what that feels like for you to hear today. So as I mentioned before, I self-discovered and then later was diagnosed both autistic and ADHD. And the way I had made sense of that before in my life was that I'm a bicultural person. As I mentioned in the intro, I grew up both in the United States and in the Dominican Republic, speaking both English and Spanish. American culture, or I should say United Statesian culture. I don't like the word American because there's South America, there's Central America. There's a lot more Americans than just the United States. But United Statesian culture and Dominican culture, super different. And some of those differences actually parallel autism and ADHD. And what I actually came to realize is that those differences were present in my brain before I traveled cross-culturally. I just was able to express different parts of me in Dominican culture that I was not able to in the United States before when I was growing up. So autism, for example, craves routine and structure. I can't tell you how important that is to me. I eat the same thing for breakfast just about every morning. And if I show up to make myself my bagel with cream cheese, with Italian seasoning and garlic salt, if I show up to make that and any one of those ingredients is missing, it is profoundly distressing. I can't explain it to you. It is profoundly distressing. So one of the ways my wife shows me love is by buying extra so that there's always everything bagels in the freezer, so that there's always extra containers of cream cheese and those spices that I like. But the autistic brain craves routine, structure, predictability. The ADHD brain craves novelty, spontaneity. Those both exist inside me. They're both an important part of who I am and how I'm wired. And as you can imagine, they are often at odds with one another. So I actually found a lot of comfort with this third culture identity that was able to say, well, I've got the spontaneity and the novelty of the Dominican Republic and the fun and the adventure, and I've got the structure of the United States and the organization. Actually, it's autism and ADHD. But they were given more expression in those different cultures, and they were more okay and normalized and even celebrated in those different cultural spaces. My discovery story and diagnosis story is different from a lot of people because oftentimes people will have a child who gets diagnosed, for example, and then they'll start to realize, wait a second, I actually have those same traits that my child has, and they got this diagnosis of autism or ADHD or whatever the case may be. Maybe I am that as well. Or sometimes people will have a parent or a friend or a spouse or a loved one who sees them and says, something different here. Maybe you might be interested to check out autism or ADHD or neurodivergence. And I didn't have any of that. No one suspected I was neurodivergent. I was incredibly high masking. If you're familiar with that term, it means a lot of things that we could unpack in a bigger way on another podcast, but essentially it means that I hide my autistic and ADHD traits and that I find ways to appear more neurotypical. And I had been doing that my whole life. I had actually been masking my neurodivergence from myself and from the world around me. So no one suspected. In fact, I can remember when I first took the masking assessment, and it was asking me all these questions about masking behaviors. I was shocked because I thought the whole world was doing those things. I thought those were normal. I thought that's how everyone showed up to be human, was by pretending, by monitoring their facial expressions and body language at all times, or using 100% of your energy in the conversation to maintain eye contact with the person you're talking to so they know you're interested and engaged. And I just thought that's what you did to be human. But it turns out that's what you do when you're trying to look as neurotypical as possible and you're hiding your own neurodifference. And like I mentioned earlier, I actually never paid attention to my own experience of what it was like to be me in the world. I was just always referencing the people around me and making sure that they were having the best experience possible, drawing them out and centering them in the conversations. And so I just was unaware. And it's beautiful and it's profound to me that it was actually God who knows me and who's always known me. God who knit me together in my mother's womb, made me fearfully and wonderfully. And God invited me into a journey of getting to know my own face, the uniqueness of who I am, and inviting me to show up in relationship. First to God, and then to myself and to others with my own face. That is beautiful to me. So after self-discovery, which was a period of about, 5 months, like I said, super deep dive, 2 hours a day. I can remember going through the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is used for diagnosing, and looking at all the criteria for autism one by one and keeping this running document with how I experienced those criteria in my life and how they showed up. I was just so fascinated and intrigued and coming alive, and I couldn't get enough of it. My family got tired of hearing me talk about autism and ADHD. A quick shout out to my family. Sorry, y'all. I know it was a lot. Special interest energy for sure. I saw it everywhere, right? Well, that's an autistic trait. Oh, that's an ADHD trait. Oh, this extra sensitivity to rejection. You might be curious about that, blah, blah, blah. And I just, everything was about autism and ADHD for at least those 5 months. And as I started to become more and more sure that this is who I am and this is who God created me to be, I knew that I was going to talk about it. I knew that I was going to share about it. And for me, I wanted the safety and the affirmation and the validation of a professional diagnosis, so that I wasn't just appropriating something or claiming something that wasn't true. And so I went through the diagnostic process. Funny, I just, even in the process of being diagnosed, I was beginning to unmask a little bit. So on one of the exams that I took, or one of the assessments, I should say, I can remember actually in the margins correcting spelling errors that were on this printed assessment, and then later the assessor thanked me for that. And I can remember also giving so much detail. Well, I would rate this a 1 in these scenarios, and I would rate this a 5 in these scenarios. So I'm going to give it a 3 because of this, but it actually could be a 1, or it could be a 5. Those kinds of questions are particularly hard for me, like what's the most or what's the worst, or rate on a scale of 1 to 5, like in what category, at what moment, like this is really hard. Anyway, and I went through this whole diagnostic process, and I'll never forget after the personal interview and interview with loved ones, and then I'm sitting down with this autism specialist, doctor of psychology, and she says, I want you to know I've taken all of your assessments into consideration, interviews into consideration, etc., and I want you to know that I'm 100% certain that you are autistic. And I began to cry. Not weep, but tears were flowing. And it was so validating to have a professional actually affirm my internal experience. And I had experienced so much of the opposite my whole life, where my internal experiences were minimized, or I was told, no, that sound isn't too loud, or you should be okay with this, or, whatever the case may be. But to have a professional person who's an expert actually affirm my internal experience and the knowing that I had on the inside of me, that was priceless to me. I immediately shared the diagnosis pretty broadly, actually, with my Facebook and Instagram community, thousands of people that I've connected with over the years through social media, and it was profoundly healing for the most part, to receive so much encouragement, support, some people saying welcome to the club, just a lot of connection and goodness there that I wasn't expecting. I knew I wanted to share. I like to be as honest and upfront as possible, and if something important is going on in my life, I want everybody to know. I also knew I wanted to share on social media so that I could start showing up to situations more unmasked, and I wouldn't have to talk in a one-on-one conversation to everyone in my life to say, oh, by the way, here's my diagnosis and here's what this means. I could share more broadly, and then I could just give myself more permission to show up in social situations less masked without having to explain that individually to everyone. Had some really difficult responses, and maybe I'll share those later on another podcast. Some really hurtful responses. It was not all sunshine and cool breezes, to say the least. But I will say, and I kind of want to end here for today, I'm sensing kind of my energy winding down. I've noticed in the last year or so of my life, I'm about a year and a month or so out from my official diagnosis of autism and ADHD. And also at the same time, was diagnosed, or not diagnosed because you can't be diagnosed, but the assessor affirmed, you're also gifted. And so there's this unique experience of what it is to be gifted, which I'm not a fan of that term, but that's a real positive sounding term that gets affirmed a lot. And then to also have what I know and affirm in myself as social disabilities, autism and ADHD, and how all of that works together to make me who I am. Yeah, but what I was going to say is that I've noticed over the last year how much shame has dissolved in my life. I can't put enough words to describe it, but it's like layer after layer of shame is just being shed. God is just releasing and freeing me from so much shame that I carried. I was ashamed to be myself in the world because I sensed that when I was myself, it didn't go well and people didn't understand it. It bothered people. I was shamed for being myself, and I took some of that on. I realized a lot of the shame that I've shed over the last year or so was never mine to begin with. It was given to me, and I embraced it, took it on the inside of me, and God has just been slowly dissolving that. Those who look to the Lord, I've actually never thought, this is one of my favorite verses from Psalm 34, and I've never put it together with my story, but it says, those who look to the Lord are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. And I just think about that in the light of my face-to-face relationship with God. God often affirms to me in the quiet the work that I'm doing, the internal work, the healing work, the self-discovery work. God often says the work that you're doing is really important for our relationship. And I see that. I also notice that my own discovery and diagnosis has had this ripple effect that I could never have imagined. At times it felt like in my old way of thinking, it felt like a pretty selfish thing to actually pay attention to myself at this level. But I've actually seen how my discovery and diagnosis has opened the doors for people who are really close to me to be able to discover their neurodivergence and to understand themselves at a different level, to find accommodations and support that they need for more solidarity, for more connection in my relationships. I actually have more connected, deep relationships now than I've ever had in my entire life because I'm showing up more authentically. And there's just been this ripple effect that has been absolutely beautiful. So I know that's a lot of words. If you stuck with me this far, thank you. I'd love to know if any of this resonates with you. And I'd love to hear on social media over the next couple of weeks. I'd love to hear your own stories of diagnosis or discovery and how you've sensed God involved in that process. I hope to hear and platform other people's voices and other people's stories on this podcast. And yeah, I'll just close with, may you know God's work in your story. And may you sense God's invitation to you to show up to your relationship with God with your own face. I wish for you that kind of face-to-face relationship with God that I am experiencing and continuing to build myself. See you next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Neurodivergent Faith. If you like what you heard, consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing this with someone who might need to hear it too. And as you continue to wrestle with faith and identity, remember, you are a reflection of the vast creativity of our Creator. May you trust that God knows you, delights in you, and is working in you exactly as you are. And may you know that you are not walking this journey alone. See you next time.